Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you here this evening. I might have to take this off in case you can't hear me very well. On February 10th, an ad hoc committee was appointed to review the contract for ordinance number 707, dated October 8th, 2018, authorizing the development of a new county administration building to better serve the citizens of Fairfield County, the execution of delivery of a lease agreement and associated contracts necessary to effect the intent of this ordinance, and other related matters, and ordinance number 740, authorizing amendments to a lease agreement provided for a new county administration building to better serve the citizens of Fairfield County, and other related matters. This meeting is in response to the questions raised about the contract and associated costs. I would like to welcome Attorney Roy Jones, Attorney Tamika Isaac Devine, and Rory Dowling. Thank you so much. I know Mr. Dowling represents the first and main developers. Okay, if you want to start giving us an overview.
Yeah, so to be honest, we didn't have anything formal to present today. We were under the impression it was going to be more of a question and answer and have representatives here to answer questions that you all have regarding the contract. I did pass out a copy of some questions and answers that we put together that we thought may be helpful for you all. Just a little bit more on the background of the project, the programming that's going to be inside the complex, as to why we got involved in this project to begin with, total cost of the project, and then also how much the county is going to pay towards the project. If you have any specific questions regarding this, we are here to answer. If you'd like me to.
Okay, since this is the first time that we've seen this document, do you mind going over it? Because it looks as if no one else in the audience has it, so that they can get an idea as to what you presented here.
Absolutely. So we'll start on page 1 here. We'll start with the first question of why did the county explore a new location for the complex in the first place? This really is tied most closely to the fact that retrofitting this current complex was going to be very cost prohibitive, upwards of $3 million just to address roof and mechanical equipment, which were the most urgent needs. It's also a building of only 21,000 square feet. And at the time when we first started talking with Mr. Taylor and his team, it was apparent that they needed upwards of about 45,000 square feet to house the county's facilities.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk about the programming that is going to be at the new facility. We are turning the historic auditorium into public meeting space to be used for county council meetings, as well as any other public use. So when I say any other public use, I really mean that. If you haven't been in the space yet, which I welcome you all to do whenever you would like, you're going to get a sense for just how broad and how large that space is. It's going to accommodate upwards of 400 people for community players groups, concerts, weddings, church groups, really you name it. The historic cafeteria building is going to be renovated to expand the school enrichment services that the county already provides. When we first started the program, there was an extensive waiting list for that program, which I believe still exists today. And we're going to be able to offer about 90 additional spaces with that cafeteria space rehab. Mm. The historic classroom building, and if you want to follow on this page here, you can see the overview, but the historic classroom building, which is the largest structure on the campus, is going to house the admin offices. So county administrator offices, as well as the 911 call center, in addition to the sheriff's department. There's one more building, or I guess there's 2 more buildings. The historic gymnasium is going to be rehabbed into a gymnasium. It will be used by Parks and Rec for basketball. We're going to be putting in implants for volleyball as well. There's going to be a lot of room on either side of the basketball court to bring in sort of 7-foot tall partitions that you all can use. The county can program that space for spin classes, yoga, a lot of the programs that you all are already offering, but it just gives you a broader ability to do so. There's going to be a new fitness center in the back of the gym, on that small building towards the back. It will be about 1,000 square feet fitness center, in addition to men's and female lockers, and some additional office space for Parks and Rec. The oldest building on the campus, the 1880s teachers building that you see there, is really right now still sort of open. It's been discussed that it could be Fairfield County's first welcome center, visitor center. It's been discussed it could be used by economic development for some meeting space, and it's also been discussed to potentially house some museum uses. Some ideas were African American Heritage Museum, telling the history of education in Fairfield County. We already did a lot of that work with the group that was here, working with a lot of the local community residents on the early end of this project. But really, that's going to be space that the county can do whatever they want with.
Mhm.
Any questions on the uses?
I don't have any. Any of you have any on the usage? Okay.
I did have a question here, sort of why is my development group, why are we working on this project? I have a lot of close ties and still have close ties to Winsboro. My grandmother was born and raised here. Her family, she was here still living up until last year when she passed away. Her brother spent a lot of time trying to preserve this building. So I have close family ties to Fairfield County, to Winsboro, to this building in particular. In about 2017, when the town was coming close to demolishing the building, I was started thinking about ideas of what could happen there. We originally thought about housing, potentially teacher housing for that site. It quickly became apparent that the surrounding neighborhood was not going to entertain any sort of housing use because they were not very enthusiastic about that use. And I started talking with Jason about the idea of converting it into a county complex. And when he first told me about the problems they were having with this building, as well as the space needs, it became evident that this building could be adaptively reused as a county complex. The main reason why it makes sense for a private developer to do this project, which I'm a private developer, this is a private project, but it's a public-private partnership. The reason why it makes sense to be redeveloped by the private sector is because we have access to historic tax credits, new market tax credits, and abandoned building tax credits, which are assisting with that $13.5 million price tag. And when I say assisting, what that means is at the end of the day, the cost to the county, which you all are contractually obligated to put forward, is going to be no more than $8.7 million contractually. And so essentially, you're able to save about $4.8 million, or roughly a third of the total costs that are going into rehabbing that structure.
Okay, so as I understand it, then it's going to be $8.7 million to upfit the building? Is that the
So
cost?
no, the total cost to upfit that building is $13.5 million. That does not include certain costs that the county has added to the scope with some additional upfit items that have been requested over the past 4 to 5 months.
Okay, so it's 13.5, not including any things that the county has added.
That's correct. Right now are roughly 400 to 500,000. And that is the cost to the private sector. So that is the cost to us to do this project. The cost to the county is going to be $8.7 million plus the amounts that you all decide to upfit the building with.
Okay. Say that once more. You want
Go
you? Go ahead.
Yes, ma'am.
Go on, Tim.
Sure.
Yeah, I have a question. Couldn't the county have sold tax credits themselves?
No. Tax credits are can only be utilized by the private sector because it's basically a credit against income tax. So I can't use those tax credits myself. I wish I could. But what we do is we go and sell them to a third party, which tax credit investor, banks, large corporations that have the ability to use those tax credits, and we sell them for about 75 cents on the dollar, and we use that money to finance the project.
Okay.
I want
We're able to utilize, so out of the $13.5 million project, about 50%, even a little bit more, closer to 55% of this project is being financed with those tax credits, that tax credit equity that we were able to sell to that third party.
So just say that once more. I got the $13.5 million cost. And there will be additional costs to upfit the facility. Am I right? And
Yes, ma'am. So those are
got about $400,000 worth so far?
Yes, ma'am. And those are things like grounding the wires that are going to the antennas on top of the building to service the 911 call center, There's been some modifications made here and there to adding walls here and there. Audio visual for the theater space, that's a big one. Things like that. And that 8.7 million, I should point out, so essentially the county has entered into a lease with us for a period of 7 years at 600,000 annually. So over the 7 years, that totals about $4.2 million. That's a max. There will be no more lease payment, or I mean, because the idea again is then for the county to purchase the building in year 7 for a purchase price, a max purchase price of 4.5 million.
Okay.
That's where that 8.7 million comes in.
All right. Okay, you can go ahead.
I do want to point out, so this last question here, it says who pays for the cost overruns? That's us. So that's another benefit of having the private sector do this project. When you go into a historic building, you never really know what you're going to find. We found a lot in this building, unfortunately, that were unforeseen conditions is what we call them. Now, we always build in a contingency in these projects, typically of about 10%. And so we had a contingency of a little over $900,000 when we first started this project. We don't have any more contingency. So we've gone through the contingency. Thankfully, we're getting towards the end of the project, so there aren't too many surprises, we don't think, apart from the price of lumber. But we are assuming that responsibility. So that is eating into our developer fee. And to be honest, it's eating into it pretty significantly. But that's a responsibility that we bore on the front end, and we knew we had that risk. And so that's not the county's responsibility. And so that's really all I have, other than I included some pictures that were taken last week. If you want to follow along quickly, the first page shows some of the interior space in the auditorium. We've got some scaffolding up in that space because it's a very high building, and they are using that scaffolding to rebuild the roof right now. The next page shows some interior photographs of the historic cafeteria building. This is going to be the space that is occupied by the early childhood enrichment program. This will actually be the first building delivered. So we expect this building to be completed within the next 30 to 45 days. And so we're pretty excited about that. And so, you all can start moving stuff in if you would like during that time. And then the last page shows some images of the historic classroom building, which is going to be office space for the county. So this is on the 3rd floor. I like that shot in the bottom there in the middle that sort of shows you a view from that 3rd floor overlooking the town green space there through the historic windows.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to finish with the site has dried out a little bit, which is nice. We had a lot of rain. We've finally been able to do some site work. You can see it on the last page here. It is a clay pit out there. It was very muddy over the last 2 weeks, but it's dried out, and so I don't think we're going to get too much rain this week. But we would really like to schedule some tours with anybody that's interested to go out there and see the space. It's at a good spot, so you can really get a good sense of how it's going to look as a finished product, and you're not going to lose a shoe in doing so anymore.
Okay. Now, I know that there is $1 million in the escrow account.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, that $1 million is what's used for the upfitting that you're doing so far?
That's right. That is what we are using. The original point of that $1 million was to protect against the county not ending up taking space in the building, essentially breaching the contract. But we have allowed the upfit cost to come out of that escrow. It seemed like a faster way to get the funds to go to the subs that were doing the work.
And what do you term upfit? Give me
Yes, ma'am.
examples of.
So those are essentially items that were not included in the original scope that the county has elected to do in addition to what we were delivering the space as. So things like a glass partition wall here instead of a sheetrock so that the receptionist could see through. audiovisual aspects that are going into the theater, a lot of electric changes that have been made based on how many people were using this office versus that office. And like I mentioned, there's going to be significant antennas going on top of the classroom building to service the 911 call center, and all those wires need to be grounded. And so those make up the bulk of those costs. Site lighting as well, and surveillance.
There is an item there, I guess $13,000 for Auburn University. Dr. Elijah Gaddis is.
Yes, ma'am.
And that kind of explained that a little bit.
Yeah, so that was an agreement that our team and the county went in together. We agreed to split the cost of $13,000, which was that group, the community histories fellow folks that came and worked with the community to better tell the story, the history of education in Fairfield County, as well as the history of that building.
And now, did that come out of, do you know if that came out of that $1 million escrow or?
It did not.
Okay.
Did not.
All right. And now, is that escrow amount reflected in the final budget cost?
It's not part of that 8.7 million, because again, that escrow was originally there to protect against the county walking away, but we have allowed for these upfit costs to come out of that escrow account, as opposed to charging the county in addition to that escrow.
Okay.
And any funds remaining in that escrow go back to the county once you all occupy the space.
Yeah, I understand that. It's just how that money is reflected in the end. It's not reflected at all.
Well, it's not a contractual cost to the county right now, because it wasn't in that 8.7 million contract agreement. So it's essentially, it was put in place as an escrow, not to be touched until the county occupied the building. We've again allowed funds to come out of that escrow account to cover the upfit costs that the county has asked for in an effort to get those, so essentially ease of transaction.
Yeah, I just
Ray, you
wanted
can
to see
explain
how
that
that's
better now.
reflected. You know, that's the only thing that's not reflected in that total cost.
Right, because it's out of our control. We can't control what the county's sort of asking us to do in addition to the 8.7, right? To the 13.5 million. That was already agreed upon. The additional costs coming out of the escrow are what the county has asked after this agreement was in place.
Okay. Mr. Jones, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. Good evening, Ms. Green and Mr. Roseborough and Mr. Robinson and Chairman Bell. I'm Ray Jones with Parker Poe. We've been working with the county for a long time on lots of different projects, to include this one. So the final cost, the 4.2 plus the 4.5 that Rory has explained, those were what were put in place at the time that we signed the contract back in, 2018 now. And so that's the rent payment, and that's effectively the residual value. The dollars that are in the escrow account, let me take you through some hypotheticals to show you maybe, I think, how the math would work out. If those dollars had never been needed for anything during the process of this project, then once the county occupied the building, then $1 million would have gone back to the county to be used by the county in whatever way it would like. So in other words, the county could have just used it in its general fund. The county could have used it to put away for the future, to pay for the building, or whatever it might need at the time. So in this situation, because there have been additional costs that have been required during the construction of the building, and because those costs are costs that the county has requested. In other words, it's kind of like when you're building a house. You know, you got a contract price, but you walk through and you figure out, man, if I could just put more tile over here now, it'd be cheaper to do it now than to do it separate. So you ask your contractor to add it. And so there's been things like that have come along. And rather than the county having to pay out of its pocket, in other words, rather than the county having to write checks for those additions, the escrow account, which is there for the protection of Mr. Dowling and his company, they've allowed money to come out of that escrow account to pay for the additional costs that the county has asked be incurred. So basically that means in the end, the dollars that would have gone back to the county from the escrow are going to go down, but the items in the building that the county needs will go up. that make sense? I want to make sure I
Yeah,
answered your question.
it makes sense. It's just that, I'm kind of looking at a bottom line that is skewed a little bit, but that's.
Yes,
I
ma'am.
understand what you're saying.
Yes, ma'am.
Is it true now that the Mount Zion property after completion will only be assessed at $50,000 per year for tax assessment?
That's the first I've heard that number. I can say that any property taxes that are assessed to the building are passed through to the county based on the lease as an operating expense.
Now, do you have, as the owners, do you have the option to basically sell the property before the option is exercised?
No, ma'am, I do not. We do not.
Can the county assign the final lease agreement to another entity?
I do not know about the assignment rights.
Do you mean during the 7 years, Mrs. Green?
Once the option becomes available.
I see. So there are assignment provisions in these documents, and one of the things you and I talked about is the nature of the tax credits restricts certain transactions with the building for a 7-year period, which is why the lease is 7 years. At the end of 7 years, there are a couple of different options. The first option is for the building to be purchased and continually occupied as a county administration building. If, however, there's a desire for the lease to be taken on by another entity after 7 years, it could be assigned, and the pricing of the lease is already built into the lease. In other words, what the additional rent would be during those additional periods. So they would be taking it under the terms of the original lease.
When do you expect the building to be substantially complete?
The latest construction schedule that we received last week has a full delivery at the end of August. We're confident that we're going to be able to meet that deadline. I'll say that our original intent was to hand the building over in the beginning of May. Because of the numerous changes that have come at the request of the county, we are looking at a delay in our ability to deliver by that date. But we are working with our general contractor as well as the county from an inspection standpoint to hopefully deliver different aspects of the property sort of in a piecemeal. So like I mentioned, the cafeteria building, we hope to deliver in the next 30 to 45 days. And then we hope to deliver the top 2 floors of the classroom building before that end of August date.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
So if the county decides to break the lease, it will cost the county $1 million? Is that what you're saying?
No, sir, not necessarily. There we would be forced to enter into some legal ramifications with the county because we are on the hook for $13.5 million.
Okay.
So just explaining kind of the function of the escrow agreement. The idea behind the money in escrow was that if all the pre-development money or if all the pre-development efforts had been taken on and for whatever reason prior to construction, things just terminated, they ended, that $1 million was intended to try to reimburse the developer. And it was a joint agreement between the county and the developer. At this point, and my advice, if the council wanted to receive legal advice about the ramifications of walking away from the lease, that might be best done in executive session at another time. But I would say that the overall lease payment now that the building is almost constructed, as well as the other elements, would likely become the county's responsibility. So, but again, I'm glad to advise an executive session if that's what the chair wants.
Any other questions? If no other questions, think I've gone down my list of questions. Mhm.
One of the things that we talked about when you and I were together is just trying to make sure we understand, there's been a lease, there's been an amendment, and sort of understanding kind of what went on in that process. If it's useful to you all, I prepared, as requested, a very short explanation of that I'd be glad to walk through. I have copies of this. I have enough for the council members present, and I gave one to the county attorney as well. But may I hand these out to you all and we can step through those? That'd be okay?
Sure.
Thank you. Oh, that's fine.
Put my eyes on here. So some of this you've already shared with the group here, that the lease was originally approved by an ordinance in October of 2018 and was signed at that time. One of the critical things about the reason that it was signed at that point is because some of the financing that Mr. Dowling described was really predicated on this lease being in place. In other words, the lenders and even the credit providers wanted to know that there was somebody that was going to occupy this building. And the other thing I think that you all might find interesting is that the availability of some of these credits was only came to pass because of the reuse of a historical structure like Mount Zion. And so that's why the lease was signed now, gosh, almost 3 years ago, is it had to be in place before some of the financing started. So obviously the lease speaks to the 45,452 square foot administrative complex. As you'll see in just a minute, that was amended slightly. The original term is 7 years, and it's still 7 years. Mr. Dowling talked about the expected date of delivery. And then there was an original rent schedule that is set forth there on page 1. That was ultimately amended, and that was amended because the lender on the project wanted to see that it was amended. So it originally started out as set forth on page 1. It then ended up as set forth on page 2. That was within the authority at the time that was granted to the county to be able to increase the lease payment up to $600,000. And so as we got into the financing, so now that was in 2018, folks were working on the financing and discussing terms with various lenders and various credit providers. And all of that really got going in earnest toward the end of 2019. And then in 2020, very early 2020, there were several sets of changes that were requested by the lenders and the equity investors. The first one was that we needed to add some square footage to this property. So we amended the lease from 45,452 to 51,016, which, as I recall, was specifically to add the teacherage. So that was one thing, because it became very clear that the teacherage is there, and it made a lot more sense to try to develop it and try to deal with it while there was contractors on site. And there was an interest on the part of the county to have some function located there. So it was added to the lease so it could be incorporated within this. So the square footage went up. And that was one of the reasons that drove the rent to go up as well. The other reason was just candidly to make sure that there was sufficient cash flow from a lender's standpoint to take care of some of the debt that was on the property during the 7-year lease period. So at that time, that amendment, January 27th, 2020, not only was the square footage that's subject to the lease increased by almost 6,000 square feet, but the rent was reset on an annual basis, fixed for the term of the lease at $600,000 a year or $50,000 a month. One of the conversations we had about rent, and I think this is important and certainly would defer to Ms. Johnson or Mr. Taylor, but the idea behind the occupancy cost of the building is that not all of this occupancy cost would be new cost to the county. In other words, the idea is that there are some costs that the county currently pays for occupancy for other buildings around town that it would no longer have to bear if it was able to bring everything under one roof. The other idea about bringing everything under one roof, of course, is to make it more convenient for the citizens to be able to come to sort of a, if you will, a one-stop shop. And so the cost you see here are not all new costs to the county. They are incremental costs over and above what the county pays now for occupancy, and perhaps, Mr. Taylor, what the county pays for various operational expenditures for this building. And I'll certainly let you speak to that. And as you know, that's not my area of expertise, it's yours. The other thing that the amendment did, and this was critical to the lenders as well, is they wanted the ability to have the term of the lease be extended more than just 1 year at an annual basis. So we changed the extension periods in the lease to 3 additional periods of 5 years each. And only if the lease is extended, which, from the very outset, that has not been the intent necessarily. It's been the intent of the county or its facilities corporation to take title to the building and hold it for the benefit of the county, but only if the lease is extended with the rent start going up at 2.5% each year. And so that was a significant, I think, question you had last time we sat down, Ms. Green, is, when or if the rent would ever go up. And so it would only go up in the event there's an exercise of the option to renew. The final thing is, the new market tax credit provisions that I made reference to earlier are provisions that restrict the sale or an alternate use of the building during that 7-year period. The reason that's important is because the folks that have invested by purchasing new market tax credits want to make sure that the use they intended to support during the 7-year tax credit period remains. So they wanted to ensure that the use of Mount Zion remained a community asset to be used by the county for the purposes that have been identified, the services to be provided, the after-school care to be provided. And so those provisions, some of the provisions restricting uses beyond those were also added to the lease at the request of the new market tax credit investors. And by the way, all this was done at the time in consultation with administration and council. So that's sort of the history of the lease. So the lease as it exists now is the one that was amended in January of 2020, has not been changed since then, and would be the lease, would be the terms under which the county would occupy the building. So I just wanted to give you that because you asked me those questions.
Appreciate that. Are there any other questions? Okay, if not, our job basically is to bring the information back to the county council at another date. We have supposedly 60 days to do this, so it'll be done before 60 days. But I certainly thank you for coming. I thank you for sharing the information you shared. This is a huge project that has lots of consequences for the county, and we certainly appreciate your time and your efforts here this evening. Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, council members.
Sure.